Welcome to the Sheth Leadership Academy Lecture Series, a series of presentations delivered by Professor Jagdish Sheth, author of classic business books such as The 4 A's of Marketing and The Self-Destructive Habits of Good Companies. Please enjoy part 2 of Geopolitical Realignment of Markets.
Second round is more fascinating. This is going to grow because each becomes a magnet, and in the market, all of a sudden you see European Union expanding into its neighboring countries. North America now wants to do economic integration with South America. Let's take that first, then we'll take the European Union expansion, then we'll take the Asian expansion. Right after the NAFTA was formed and it was signed eventually, President Reagan immediately announced, remember this was under Carter administration that NAFTA was created. President Reagan, doesn't matter which party it is, surprisingly. President Reagan announced that we should have an extension of the NAFTA concept into what is called the Free Trade of All Americas Agreement, FTAA, as opposed to NAFTA. 34 nations, and the most critical nations in large size, raw materials, people, markets, etc., is Brazil. Brazil, Argentina, Chile became the dominant, sort of the Central and Latin American countries. There is an organization called CAFTA, CAFTA, to look at it in a different way than a NAFTA, for example. But it's really the unification, and that is the idea. Can we create more free flows, those 10 we talked about, some more aggressively than the other, by having the governments intervene less and less, but manage it geopolitically so there are no revolts in these countries, by and large, is the idea. And FTA has been still alive, although it has had several setbacks. By 2005, January, they were going to decide where would be the secretariat for FTA to be organized. For example, I was advocating the city of Atlanta as the best strategic choice, because then it becomes the gateway for the rest of the world to do business with Central and Latin America. Miami is the incumbent, and if you take the 4 or 5 flows, Miami has all the advantages. Flow of money, they have the banking system that deals with Latin America. Flow of goods, they have the seaport. Tourism, Caribbean island, for example, a lot of the tourist boats go from Fort Lauderdale, Miami, etc. People, of course, Miami has a very strong Latin culture because Cuban refugees settle in Miami. But I do believe strategically, Atlanta has a greater advantage because Atlanta has educational systems. Ultimately, you need strong universities to attract people to live there, strong interest in education for primary and secondary school so that people of the world can feel that they can put their roots and their families can have, or their children can have good school system by and large. So we have been debating which city will actually rise, but so far that dream of FTAA is evolving pretty much. Free trade of all Americas by and large is the next evolution that we see. And as I mentioned, in European Union, they have gradually begun to expand into the Eastern European countries. I believe their architecture is much more viable than ours. To get 34 nations to agree upon a common market is going to be a nightmare. We may have to do it country by country, just like what they are doing in European Union by having each of the Eastern European countries qualify. So today, European Union is a conglomerate of about 25 nations almost. Not only that, but it's creating strange reactions. Here is NATO that was designed to protect Europe against the communist Warsaw Pact, as it is called, another military alliance among the communist countries. Today, most Warsaw Pact countries, as communism is thrown out in place of a market economy, are becoming a part of the NATO. Strange bedfellows. This is the new realities that we'll have to deal with in business and in economics by and large. And I do believe it's going to expand all the way to most Eastern European countries will be a part of the European Union architecture as one common market with those free flows that we talked about. In Asia Pacific is probably the most dramatic change, less predictable, more non-intuitive, more aha. I didn't think that way. Over there, it is likely to be China, one of the emerging nations, becoming the magnet, and everybody else co-opting into that in that part of the world. And the two most powerful nations who are all advanced economies will co-opt very quickly with China as their next market to align with, such as outsourcing we talked about, of factories or low value-add industries. The two countries are going to be South Korea and Japan. Now, people have said, you must be kidding. Think about all the differences in Europe. And they argue all the time. Germans are different from French, who are different from Italians, etc. And we see all the differences. And in Japan and China, have you seen their history? My view is that history is actually legacy. This is the new realities. While we may have some tensions going in that direction, but as I mentioned, Japanese tourists are welcome today, even though they were actually World War II to really sort of atrocities they committed, etc., as I mentioned. Very different world. In fact, Taiwan, which otherwise is a hot country from a political debate viewpoint with mainland China, guess what? Most Taiwanese companies have shifted their factories in semiconductors all the way into mainland China. In other words, economics is one thing, politics is different. Our tendency is to link our political, military, and economic issues together. Over there, they tend to keep it separate. So here is Taiwan. Most of the Taiwanese companies are doing enormous business in China, even though they don't recognize each other. Just like Hong Kong, what happened to Hong Kong? Everybody thought Hong Kong after 1997 getting it back into China, the lease is expired essentially, will be demolished. Hong Kong is a thriving city today, a thriving sort of a semi-autonomous state. Very interesting change. South Korea also is moving. So companies like Samsung. More interestingly, do you know that this historical evolution of China's automobile industry, Europeans invested, Volkswagen was the largest market shareholder, and surprisingly, very recently in 2005, a brand name called Hyundai from Korea has become #1 brand in China. Not only that, but China has become the largest single market of every product that I know out of nowhere. You take, for example, China is now the second largest country in beer drinking, and I thought China was a tea drinking nation. It will surpass America as the single largest market in about a year. China already is the largest cellular telephone industry country in the world. It has more cellular telephone subscribers than anywhere in the world. It has already, in fact, close to 260, 270 million and growing exponentially with only 11 or 12% penetration. All of Europe together is just about 200 million and plateauing actually. And America is only about 165, 170 million with 60% penetration. There's no contest. China will be the largest market for landline telephone, for cellular sets as well as services, and therefore Chinese manufacturers will rise just like America rose 100 years ago. In fact, I've done an analysis to find that after World War II, Japan basically emulated the rise of England or United Kingdom in the British Empire in the, let's say, late 1700s, early 1800s. Mithi of Japan is basically Mithi of UK. They put everything right because island economy to island economy with limited resources, they thought the British approach to globalization would be the way for Japan. China, on the other hand, is more like America. Like in America, we invested massively in infrastructure, physical infrastructure, seaports, airports, railroads. Even today, cargo goes enormously on railroads. We may not have a passenger railway, but we have an enormous, in fact, cargo railway system. Trucking, we invested in highways, we invested in information technologies, for example. All the stuff we did, China is doing exactly the same. Massive investment in infrastructure. And that is the fundamental change. So China has now suddenly become a major market magnet for the world, but especially for its neighbors. So Japan is going over there. Japan was stagnant since 80s roughly. Economy went into a negative growth. And suddenly you see Japan economy coming out of the negative growth to a zero to slightly positive growth because of the trade between China and Japan. In fact, China's single largest trading partner now is Japan. Imports from Japan, mostly components, raw materials, exports from China into Japan is the largest one now. It just surpassed the trade that we have with America and China. And our trade is not as balanced, where Chinese products are enormously, lot more, almost 70% trade deficit out of the $200 billion. We export $40, $50 billion. They export $150 billion, some ungodly number. We have a trade deficit, whereas with Japan, the trade deficit is very small, just like ours is with Mexico, very small, with basically outsourcing, basically same companies doing one activity in one country and another activity in another country by and large. And this journey has just begun, and we think that block together, the ASEAN countries, Korea, Japan, China put together will be the single largest economy. China is the single largest nation, but as a region, the total population is estimated to be about 1.8 billion people, 1,800 million people. For the first time, more the people, the more the consumption, if they have the income to pay. So greater the number of people, better the market is the new theory. Unlike the old days in the 60s, remember when we thought about population control, this is just the reverse phenomenon. And by the way, there is another theory that is evolving, that if we feed the stomachs of the people and fill their wallets, income and wealth, actually we will see a decline in the population. Worldwide, we have seen that thing. With economic affluence, people want to produce fewer children. They want to invest into the education of their children. They are no longer farm hands to help you out. Illiteracy is not acceptable anymore, and given that people are in advanced countries or emerging affluent economies produce less and less children. In China, this has become even more so as a problem because China instituted a strong population control policy, one-child policy. Now it is in effect for 2 generations. Actually, Chinese scholars are forecasting that by 2050, China's population growth will be in a declining mode, unlike India, for example. That's the evolution that's taking place. So that's a very key block to understand. That block, my view, will become, it's about $1 trillion trade, will surpass European Union in terms of internal trade, will definitely surpass the NAFTA, going all the way to free trade, FTAA as it is called, which is CAFTA and NAFTA together. That is the alignment. 3 blocks are becoming larger and larger, markets are growing, and this is sort of a happy scenario, but not so fast. There are all kinds of obstacles coming in the way. So let's talk about some of those. Who is left out? I raise this question all the time, and immediately people will say, how about Africa? Africa have to be understood in terms of 3 parts of Africa. Northern Africa above Sahara is all Middle East architecture, beginning with Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, etc. So we will put that as a part of the Middle East. South Africa is the most exciting part. It is the most advanced part of Africa. South Africa has been evolving over time because of its apartheid policy. America began to boycott investment, trade, anything, put pressure that led to the election of Mandela as the president. He was released from the jail. The white majority political power was shared at least by the Africans, South Africans in this case. My forecast is that Mandela or no Mandela, the future of South Africa will lie with the Europeans. Their value systems are much more similar, surprisingly, and they're not British. Even though South Africa was a British colony, a part of the British Commonwealth, surprisingly the same 50, 60 wealthy families who run the economy of the country are all Dutch and German origin, just like in Latin America, in Brazil, for example, or in Argentina. And they are likely to, in fact, see much more commonality. The definition of capitalism varies between America and Europe. The definition of democracy varies between America and Europe. These are totally 2 different ideologies. And Africa feels much, much closer in its affinity to actually, in fact, European Union. So my forecast is that South Africa and Southern Africa, such as Zimbabwe, which is the Rhodesia, even Angola, etc., will combine together with the leadership of South Africa and will align with the Middle East. With the European Union. Middle East also will align. By the way, what about Central Africa, right? We'll come to Middle East a little later on. Central Africa will be basically what we call a no man's zone or no person's zone. Any country that says, I'm for market economy, I'm for economic reforms, the old ideology-driven anti-colonial things is all gone, everybody will race. Like it's a new gold mine world has discovered. We don't know who will be having a dominant position. Although my forecast is that all of Central African nations, one at a time, will also begin to align with European Union. They have a deep, deep relationships for 150, 200 years. The French colonial powers, the German and the Dutch colonial powers, the British colonial powers, Italian at one time even, Spaniards at one time, given all that thing, the deep-rooted relationships are so strong that I do believe that, again, the Central Africa will feel more comfortable aligning with the European Union. So European Union surprisingly goes south big time. What about the Middle East? I also believe Middle East will align permanently with European Union, especially if Turkey gets economically integrated into European Union, which is going to happen. It's a matter of time. Turkey is a very strategic nation, and I do believe all of Middle East, starting with Morocco on the one hand, going through Egypt, going through, in fact, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and almost at the border of Afghanistan. That's the Middle East architecture that is likely to align with the European Union. Again, their definition of capitalism, their definition of democracy is much, much easier to understand by the Middle East people than it is around here, especially with the British. Lots and lots of Middle East capital after the first oil embargo of the 1970s, when the Arab world made enormous money, that was all housed in England, more so than in the Swiss banks. Swiss understand that culture, British understand that culture, and not only that, but in the old days, Germans, it invited, in fact, lots of Kurds to come as guest workers. So they have a significant amount or the number of Muslim population. So it's not just Islam aspect I'm talking about, it's the Middle East aspect, because there are countries which may be non-Islamic also in the Middle East architecture. So Middle East is going to go in that direction. Well, people immediately say, okay, what about Australia or New Zealand? No question. Australia became very smart. In the 80s, late 80s, began to look at its future for the 21st century and decided their future lies with China or the ASEAN bloc and the China. All of a sudden, Australian policies changed, especially immigration policy, began to look into the future. While it is a country that originated from UK, it aligned, in fact, after World War II with America. It is now aligning, surprisingly, a very pragmatic nation, aligning with the Asian bloc by and large. So we think New Zealand and Australia will align on that side. There are about 11, 12 industries in which, like the Finland with Nokia, the Australian companies can have access to a much larger market, and they don't have to compete as strongly in the European market or the American market. And what are those industries? Well, the wine industry. Australia will become the largest wine producer in the world. In fact, I have forecasted both the Napa Valley as well as the French vineyards will surrender to Australia as the primary wine growing nation in the world. And China, just like beer, is going to become one of the largest wine consuming countries of the world. Australia also makes good beer. Australia is very good in heavy engineering, exploration, oil, gas, etc. Did you see the largest contract given by China was to an Australian company, about a $20 billion in exploration, more so than the Europeans and the Americans. Australia opened up its immigration, mostly of Chinese people. Monash University, which is the largest university with about 70,000 students, guess what? 60% of all the students are foreign students. Unthinkable. There's no university I know in America that has 60% of their student population as foreign students. Not only that, Australia's education system, which is the old British system, is expanding into the ASEAN bloc. Having, in fact, University of New South Wales will open up a campus in Singapore. 8,000 students will be studying there. Just goes on. And they will go into Beijing, they will go into Shanghai, because education is one that another resource advantage, another core competency, if you wanted to use the word, that's what Australia has. Heavy engineering, education, for example, capital markets to some extent. There are several, and they've identified 11, 12 industries where Australia actually can have access to a much larger market if they understand how to play the game right. So Australia is going to go in that direction. Well, what about Russia? People always ask that question. Well, my view is that Russia will eventually align with the European Union also. As you know, Russia's evolution is very painful to talk about because they had understood in late 70s that communism as an ideology has already bankrupted the whole bloc. There's nothing they can do. Economically, it's a bankrupt economy. The Kamakan architecture, which means each country makes one product to sell it to other countries, had just collapsed. So Russia surprisingly wanted to go for a transformation, like China has done successfully. The person they appointed was Andropov. You might remember that name in the late 70s. Andropov's job was to have the Communist Party move toward more and more economic approach to life as opposed to ideology approach. Unfortunately, he died on the job within 1 year, and there was a political void, and out of the whole political turmoil, Gorbachev came as a rising politician. Gorbachev, with his perestroika, as he called it, sort of a liberalization movement, etc., kind of a notion, began to align with the British and the Americans. It was very fascinating. Mrs. Thatcher went, met him, said, "Here, I can trust this person." Remember, President Reagan had this famous slogan, trust but verified. That was related to that concept that we are not so sure communists are still ready for us, kind of a notion. But America also blessed Gorbachev. And so Gorbachev was steering the Russian economy toward the British-American architecture. But surprisingly, when he was out of favor, Yeltsin came as the next leader, and Yeltsin began to structure the Russian economy in alignment with the European Union. And I'm totally convinced Putin will do it. Vladimir Putin is probably the most strategic political leader in the world other than the Chinese. They have the most natural resources of anybody that I can think about. They are the dominant oil and gas country in the world. With the oil price rises, it's not the Middle East who's going to make as much money as the Russians will do. But not only that, they have a huge educated class of people. One key advantage communist nations gained, unlike capitalistic nations, is that they made education and work mandatory by both genders. Women have to work out in the factories as men have to work. So you have a talented workforce which is much bigger in size than even in America. This country knew how to build technologies. They were a super military power. They were the first ones to go into space. Sputnik, as it was called, and America took as a challenge to see if we can equalize it. In fact, if you look at the history of America, even the space technology came from the Europeans, Germans, when the Jews migrated out over here, brought the space technology. All the atom bomb, hydrogen bomb, space technology all came to America as sheer blessing because of the European turmoil. Just like in 1800s, the colonial power and the European turmoil benefited America. So Russia is a very strategic nation, has more resources than most people realize, and we need to appreciate that as a strategic player in the world. Russia's politics, Russia's definition of capitalism, Russia's definition of democracy again will be closer to the European approach than the American approach again. And you will again see the tension that America will not see Russia in the right way and the Russians will not see America in the right way. You may have a personal friendship between leaders, but politically the two nations are not likely to align as it was likely to happen under Gorbachev. So I do believe Russia will align with the European Union, which certainly makes European Union a much larger economic power and military power and a political power. In fact, today, Russia is a part of G8. Russia is invited to the table. And the next two powers that will be invited would be China and India is my forecast. Eventually, Brazil, the BRIC report that I mentioned earlier, those four nations will join the G7 meetings and will become G11 in the process. So that's about Russia. Well, what about India, another major nation? The notion is that India is likely to be aligned, and there's a chart that I have which pretty much talks about these things. So let's see if I can show that again. India obviously is in the middle of thinking about where to align. Like Russia, India is basically political changes are taking place. By the way, back to Russia. Russia, in the void of a political leadership and the turmoil, guess what happened was that the entrepreneurs took charge of the nation. Mafia element came in big time. A lot of money was siphoned off the country, and the government will actually now take charge of the nation. You see currently the phenomenon with UCOs and Khodorkovsky issues, by and large, will be reformed enormously. And by the way, there's nothing new again, because it sounds so radical in the 21st century, but this is exactly the issue we had in America in 1800s. We had a bunch of entrepreneurs who came, made enormous money in this country, and they were not necessarily investing back into the economy here. Same phenomenon. If you look at the history of America, it was as abusive with the rise of capitalism and all this stuff in the early days, especially after the Civil War. After 1850s, 1860s, in fact, when we had a unification, you saw tremendous economic growth, and you see the same phenomenon by and large, So we had the same sort of elements. Unorganized sector was popular. It is still popular, just as is in Russia. We don't look at ourselves from the same view as we look at other nations. I think it's very important for us to understand. So that's what's happening to Russia. India at one time thought that they would align with America. Under the previous government, India is a very important story to understand because it is one of those four key countries, and we'll talk about China and Brazil in the same way. India got into significant trouble in 1991 with the Gulf War. Gulf War, of course, where Iraq attacked Kuwait. We pushed Kuwait, Iraqis back. President Bush Sr. became the most popular president in the process because we saved the nation. We were like the heroes. But it had a major impact on India also, along with Jordan. $1.5 billion of cash flow coming of Indians working in Kuwait came to a screeching halt. In addition, Russia was providing oil through Iraq to India. That came to a screeching halt, additional $1 billion of import cost. This was all sort of the political alignment, and those two cash flows came to a screeching halt. So the Indian central bank, called the Reserve Bank of India, went into a crisis. The reserves went under $2.5–3 billion, and therefore government has no choice but to change its economic policy. Rather than following the traditional sort of the socialistic communist policy where private sector capitalism cannot be trusted, that you have to have government own and operate enterprises, India actually nationalized all of the private banks in the process. India was everything done by what is called the license Raj, R-A-J, which means license regime. Raj is back to the Indian monarchy word for Indian kings. And those guys were in charge. They had the British system in place, both legal, judiciary, all the systems in place. The financial, all the stuff was in place. But the economy became isolated, insulated. The trade of India, which was 1.5% of the world trade, began to become become as low as 0.1% because the rest of the world grew in trade. India had restricted policies about what can be imported and what can be exported. It became insulated, isolated economy and began to go on a downward spiral essentially. It also was a part of the non-alignment movement. You might remember names like Nehru, who was the first prime minister, and Nasser becoming the key global leaders to create a third bloc, as it was called, that neither communism nor capitalism, we will be a third powerful force, all of the emerging nations, all of the colonial powers. And unfortunately, that bloc really looked more like aligning with the communists. They had kicked out Coca-Cola as a company. IBM was not allowed to come into India, for example, all this stuff. And it was really anti-American, anti-British attitudes were prevailing. That began to shift enormously with a crisis. The government that was in charge, which was the incumbent Congress Party is the one that led to the freedom movement, India becoming independent, had survived. There were a lot of changes in the world, came back in power, and now the economists took over. Remember in the earlier chart when I showed you economic integration, it is economic approach as opposed to military and integration. Well, the economists took over the country. In fact, in Latin America, you saw top economists becoming political leaders. Salinas has a PhD in economics from America, and he was the president of Mexico when NAFTA took place, for example. Vicente Fox is a senior executive of one of the large enterprises, Coca-Cola company, goes into politics, which was unthinkable. Only ideologies guys went into politics, mostly having a law degree. Today, that's not the case. The two most ministers in most of these emerging nations are the Minister of Finance and the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Not as much the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, what we call Secretary of State, or the Minister of Defense. Those are still important, but these two other ministries are becoming even more important. Fundamental shift. So India began to go through that change. Congress Party unfortunately lost out. The change did not take place enough. Elections took place and the opposition party gained the power in a coalition called BJP, B as in boy, J as in James, P as in parent. And it began to shift India's alignment with America. That party is out of the favor now, and the Congress has come in, and we don't know India will align with any one bloc or India will align with all the blocs. So India's politics are something not predictable as much, and there is an interesting evolution taking place as China and India emerge as two major super economic powers based on purchasing power parity. There is even a possibility that China and India will get together economically, politically, and even militarily. Have you seen the trade of India and China? From less than $200 million 7-8 years ago, it just crossed $14 billion. And we think the trade may become one of the largest trading partners. A recent visit by the Prime Minister of China in India bluntly said that if India and China can get together, they'll be the single largest economic driver of the 21st century, which has a massive impact on American architecture, the region, as well as, in fact, the European architecture. So we have to watch those geopolitical dynamics and what the governments will do in shaping the markets by and large. So that's India. India was almost forecasted to be a part of the American bloc, essentially, but now the debate is on whether it will be or it will become just one big magnet. Like China really is one big magnet, everybody aligns there with Japanese and the Koreans taking a lead, but the Europeans have to go to China, Americans have to go to China, maybe India will become the same way. The last country I want to talk about is Brazil. Very strategic, very important. Again, Brazil politics have changed. The Lula government that came in has been strongly distancing from America. The FTA dream that Ronald Reagan had, which was articulated, orchestrated by the American government, there is a counter evolution taking place. The CAFTA nations that I mentioned, Brazil is actually taking CAFTA nations as a lead and aligning with China. China is emerging very important nation, not only its domestic market, but China needs resources. Resources are mostly in these countries. In India, you have the industrial resources with a large land mass. Brazil, another major resource. Brazil is actually the steel capital of the world because it has iron ore, etc. China needs all that. China needs oil. China needs industrial chemical raw materials, etc. So China is actually investing into Brazil. China has promised $20 billion of infrastructure investment in Brazil, just like the colonial powers invested in America 100 years ago. Isn't that fascinating? They have claimed they will invest, in fact, again, like $10 billion in Argentina. So Brazil will become another magnet. It may not necessarily align with America, but it may become like China is today, India second, Russia third, Brazil may become magnet for everybody. We don't know what's going to happen to Brazil in the process. Very important nation to understand. And by the way, the FTA is not evolving as nicely as we thought, because here is another nation, a very large oil producing nation. After the Ayatollah Khomeini movement in Iran, after the Iraq War, Gulf War especially, the three nations from which we imported oil in America, besides producing our own, is gone. Iran, we don't buy anything. Iraq, we don't buy anything. Instead, we substituted with Alaskan pipeline we built, especially after the energy crisis. We began to allow more the independent oil exploration in this country. But our biggest oil supplier suddenly became Venezuela. Today, Saudi Arabia and Venezuela almost offer the same amount of oil to America. Fortunately, both of them offer under 10% of the total daily demand that America has. We buy from about 6-7 sources. But Venezuela is distancing now from America also. Chavez government is not in favor of the American approach. So we think that the CAFTA movement with Brazil, Venezuela, Argentina will align some other place, but we don't know exactly where. So the North-South economic integration in the America bloc may not come about the same way as we thought. Predictability will be less over there than in the European Union evolution, where the predictability seems to be much clearer, and of course the Asia bloc on the other side. If you analyze these things, what does it tell me? It says, for the first time, to simplify this broad trend, think about the evolution of trade and investment, those 10 flows that I talked about. After the Industrial Revolution and colonial expansion was east-west. Everything happened east-west. As far above the equator, as far below the equator, which will be Australia, South Africa, Argentina, Chile. Nothing around the equator. Now it is happening north-south. And not on a global basis, like east-west, but on a regional basis. European Union goes from South Africa all the way to Russia. That's a north-south architecture. From Australia, it goes all the way to Beijing and beyond. That's a north-south architecture. North America, South America, that's a north-south architecture, interestingly. And the only countries that will not have some sort of a relationship of this kind are likely to be, in fact, as you will see, are pretty much the fourth world economies, where these countries have no resources that they can offer to the world, and they actually become economic burden. There are several nations like that, which probably would be served more through foreign aid and other mechanisms. People think about countries like Bangladesh. I don't believe so. I think Bangladesh will be revitalized very nicely into the part of the SAARC architecture. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, as it is called, or Ceylon in the old days, India, and other neighbor, they become one big market, and then they will get revitalized very quickly, is my forecast. But there are many, many nations like that in Africa, in Asia, in South Africa, and in South America, that are likely to remain isolated for quite some time till they have a significant economic reform. By the way, these reforms are relatively quick to do, which is why geopolitical dynamics or geopolitical realignments are more volatile than market movements. Today, a country may announce a complete economic reform and you create a miracle. Think about the miracle in Singapore that Lee Kuan Yew, the first founding prime minister, did it. British left the Navy, infrastructure was in place, country was desperate. They decided, all right, we'll become capitalistic, not democratic the way we know it, but we'll be capitalistic. Use the infrastructure to invite manufacturing. It's called the Jurong Project, and the rest is history. Well, this is duplicated by Dubai today. Think about the excitement in Dubai. It is even surpassing what Singapore miracle was created. And there are many places, Hong Kong that I mentioned, same way is happening. So we need to watch that very interestingly, that it can happen very quickly. So this is the dynamics that we see happening around here. So I will probably stop here, take a break, and then come back with the second part of this presentation about if we believe that this is the evolution taking place, then what structural changes will take place that impact the market.
Thanks for listening to this lecture, Geopolitical Realignment of Markets, Part 2, with Professor Jagdish Sheth. For more about Professor Sheth and the Sheth Leadership Academy, visit www.shethleadershipacademy.com.